Thank you, Wendy. That was great. So let's have a conversation. We have a few minutes to really talk about these issues in more depth, and I want to encourage all the viewers to either put in a comment in your Facebook Live or go to the Genome TV and put into the chat. But we want your questions so that we can incorporate that into our conversation. But I want to start with a question for the two of you. Thinking broadly about genetic ancestry testing and its value to society, which both of you talked about in different ways. But can you just talk more about, do you think genetic ancestry testing has a value to our society?
Dr. Popejoy, do you want to tackle that one first? I'm curious to hear the scientist's perspective. Mute.
Thanks for the reminder to unmute myself. You know, I think ancestry is such a personal thing in terms of identity. So whether it has value for individuals, I'm sure it does. I'm sure there are many people for whom it has value. In terms of science, you know, ancestry inference is done to aid in analysis when we're teasing out what genetic factors are contributing to different traits or diseases. Ancestry calculated from genetic data is used as a way to sort of control for the genomic background that might be really similar between people with similar ancestries. So it definitely has value in a scientific space to help us make really accurate predictions about what parts of the genome are important. But in terms of the scientific value of the direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry test, I'm not so sure about that. I personally, there might be, but personally I haven't ever used data from those companies or attempted to. But I'm sure that there are some scientists out there who have made, you know, really cool analyses using data collected through those companies.
So what I would say in terms of the research that I've done, I completely agree with Dr. Popejoy that I think that on an individual level, these tests can be meaningful to people. Sometimes meaningful in a bad way, sometimes meaningful in a good way. So sometimes people find out things that they wish they didn't know, like, you know, that there was a family secret that they can't unlearn. So there are certainly risks involved, but sometimes you can learn about connections, which can be very personally meaningful. So I'll give you a personal example. I reconnected, or actually connected for the first time, with a family member, my father's first cousin, who I had never known before, and found her through genetic ancestry testing. And I do hear a lot of stories like that of people who discover or reconnect with a particular individual. I think it also can be very helpful for people who maybe are adopted or don't know very much about their family. So I think thinking about it in terms of personal connections to individuals is perhaps one useful way to think about it. In terms of thinking about it with regard to group identities, what group am I a part of? What is my heritage? What is my lineage? What is my history? I think there is potential for misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And I won't go so far as to say that no good can come out of it, because some of the research that I've done actually looks at whether taking these tests can change people's belief in racial essentialism. As I mentioned, this is this idea that races are determined by our genes and that different races are better or worse at certain things, or maybe just better or worse altogether. And that's a very negative, harmful view in most cases, because it's very strongly associated with racism. Well, a lot of people were concerned that these tests are going to reinforce belief in racial essentialism. And what I found, in just one study, it needs to be replicated, is that for some people that does happen. But for some people, actually the opposite happens. For people who go into these tests already knowing quite a bit about genetics, it can actually reduce their belief in genetic essentialism. So I think that these tests, have the potential for some good and they also have the potential for bad. And I just encourage everyone to really learn about them and go in with their eyes open.
Thank you. So Wendy, with regards to your research and the participants in your study, those that changed their perception of their identity, did that continue over time? Do people maintain that modified social identity over time, or does it change back?
So what I found in my study, and it wasn't a representative sample, it was just 100 people who contacted me and said that they were interested in participating in this study, was that the identities that they reported having changed. So I spoke with all of them after they had taken a test. So they're telling me how their identities changed. And I interviewed them at one point in time, and they told me about that change. And then I interviewed them again about 18 months later. And there was very little change between those 2 points. So most of the time when people say that their identities have changed as a result of testing, they do tend to be fairly long-term. And another thing that I found interesting, although really it's just suggestive because this was only a very small portion of my overall study or overall sample, was that of the people who did say that their identities changed, and I was able to interview them again in the second interview, about 80% of those people said that they had marked the new racial or ethnic identity on the 2010 census. So there might actually be some implications for not just personal identity, but also government statistics and how we represent ourselves to others, and maybe even how the society's demographics might change if that is a larger trend.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to take a couple questions from online. So the first is from Bill on live stream. Is updating his question. He sent a question earlier. How much of the 0.1% variation is related to biographical ancestry or population history? How homogeneous or diverse are the major biographical groups like European? Dr. Popejoy, can you take that question?
Sure. Yeah, so there's 2 parts, right? One is about how diverse are the major biogeographic populations that I mentioned, and the other is about how much of that small amount of variation across the genome within humans is actually due to population structure or where your population history is. And actually, surprisingly, about 85% of genomic variation is found within populations. So there's more genetic diversity on average within populations than between them. And we've known this since the 70s. So there's this idea that there's some homogeneous population over here and homogeneous over here, and that they're different between them. That's actually a really common misconception, that the majority of genomic variation and the majority of genomic diversity is within populations on average. And how diverse they are within a population depends on the population. So as I mentioned in my talk, in Africa, that's where the majority of genomic variation is found because that's the ancestral population of modern humans. And as those serial migration events happened, there is less and less genetic diversity if you have what's called a founder event, where you have some subset of that genetic diversity that travels in those humans to a new location, and then there's a population expansion. So you have just a small amount of genetic diversity that traveled there, and then an expansion in the numbers of individuals without expanding the genetic diversity, because you're not introducing new variation. You're introducing new variation through mutations and things like that occur over time, but that takes a lot longer than just the natural genetic diversity that has accumulated over time in the ancestral population. So for example, in the question I think specifically called out Europeans, there's less genetic diversity in Europeans than there is in, let's say, quote unquote, African population.
Thank you. So the next question is from Carol Ritter, and this is really to go back to you, Dr. Roth. What is the implication does this information have for census information collection? You started talking about that, and we're now in a time period of collecting data in the United States. But can we maybe go into that in more depth?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I mean, so I don't want to suggest that the findings from my study are necessarily common or representative of everyone. This was just what I found among the people that I spoke with who were among the very early adopters of these tests. So they were often the ones who bought them very soon after they became available to the public. And they might be a little bit different than the people who are taking them now that the prices come down. But, you know, the people that I spoke with, a little over a third of them said that their racial or ethnic identity had changed as a result of these tests. And then about 80% of those people changed the way they marked their race or ethnicity on the census. So if you think about that, you know, often that might be somebody who is going from identifying as white to checking white and Black. Or maybe it's somebody who is going from identifying as Native American and white to going to identifying as just white. So it's moving in both ways. And the implications in terms of, you know, what this means for society is that in some ways, it's possible that these tests might lead people to think that they've sort of got free license to put down whatever they want on the census. And, you know, I know that there is a group of people out there who feel that way anyway. They don't like seeing that race question on the census. But as somebody who studies race and racial inequality, I can tell you that census data are incredibly important for understanding inequality in our society, what kind of discrimination there might be, where resources should be sent. And those kinds of decisions are really based more on how people are seen in society, what kind of social groups they participate in socially. And so while the census doesn't necessarily come out and say this, I personally think that the best way to fill out the census is based on the race that you believe that you're seen as by others. It would be inappropriate for me to say that I should check Asian just because I have 0.2% or 2% Asian ancestry, right? If I'm seen as a white person. So in terms of using census data, it's used for programs, policies, and that really depends on how we're seen by others. And if a lot of people took these tests and then felt free to check off something different on the census, that would be something that really concerned me.
Thank you. So the next question is from Max from Livestream. Personally, would you take a DNA test knowing all that you currently know?
Can I answer that first?
Yes, you can.
That is a question I've really grappled with. I think the answer is no, for me personally. Now, on the one hand, I've always been interested in genealogy, and I've always wanted to know more about my family's past and history. And so I went into this, you know, very excited to potentially expand my family tree. And I have done that a little bit. I mean, I'm thrilled to have a new member of my family as a result of these tests. But when I took a test, I was not aware of the way that people could be re-identified by their DNA. I wasn't aware of the potential for some of this information to be used in by criminal justice processing. And I have concerns about privacy, honestly, because even though I chose to contribute my DNA to this database, my relatives have not. And the fact that a relative of mine now can be identified because I made this choice to contribute to the database is something that concerns me. And I don't know how it will be used in the future. So I think if I were doing it, if I had to make the decision today, I probably would not do it.
Dr. Popejoy, do you want to share? Or?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. You know, given everything that I know, personally, I would not choose to take a genetic ancestry test. That said, I'm coming from a place of extreme privilege in that my grandfather was a hobby genealogist and did a whole genealogy of his family, of my grandmother's family. I know a lot through personal stories of my family where my ancestors came from on my dad's side as well. So I have a lot of the information that I think a lot of people are seeking through taking these tests, just by the fact that my family members have provided that information to me and that I have access to those stories. So I think maybe if I didn't have so much information about where I came from, I might be interested, but I have the privilege of having the information already and knowing what I know, not making the choice to give my own data to those companies.
Okay,
but that's not to say that others wouldn't have perfectly valid reasons for doing that.
So Dr. Popejoy, the next question's for you. And it's a question from Julia from live stream. Dr. Popejoy talked about how the methods and data underlying the direct-to-consumer ancestry tests change and thus change people's results. Does this also create problems for the use of ancestry estimation in research?
It can. Yeah, I mean, depending on the method that you're using and the reference panels that you have access to, your estimates can change. I don't know that it causes problems necessarily, other than in the context of when you're trying to harmonize data across different projects and resources. Somebody did ancestry this way, somebody else did ancestry this way, and how are you going to kind of match up those data points? But I think the question of like why we're using the ancestry estimates really impacts the answer. So with research, there's a very specific reason that you're doing ancestry estimation. It's to correct for something, versus the ancestry estimates that are changing with the different algorithms and data types through the companies, which are really about the percentages that they're reporting of the populations that your ancestors are from. So I think it's a slightly different question, and it is an issue in certain contexts in research, but I think the reason that we're doing the estimation is fundamentally different, and so it's not as problematic as you might think.
Great, thank you. So the next question, Dr. Roth, is for you, and this is from Natalie. Can you elaborate on the genetic essentialism and what is problematic or misleading about this attitude?
Sure. Thank you for asking that. So when I talk about genetic essentialism or racial essentialism, what I'm talking about is the belief that genes alone can determine what race you are, and that those genes, which are determining your race, also are determining your abilities. So your skills, your personality. So for example, one reason that this view is misleading, as I think Dr. Popejoy's work and presentation really shows, is that there aren't any genes that are determinative of what racial group you're in. Now, there is this, as we've said, humans are 99.9% alike. We tend to look at this 0.1%. Within that, we're looking at a tiny number of markers. But an important thing to emphasize is that even within those tiny, tiny percentages of markers, it's not like there is, one gene or a set of genes that determines that you are European or you are Asian, right? There are markers that are associated more with some populations than with others. So it's a probability. But those same markers that are most often found among Europeans could be found in you coming from an Asian heritage. Dr. Popejoy can add anything to that if she likes. But the core idea here is that there's nothing in your body that is absolutely deterministic or definitive in placing you in a racial category, and meaning that somebody else who doesn't have it is not in that category. So races are these ideas that we have that are very much overlapping in terms of our genetic material. I mean, think about in the United States, African Americans who have a lot of intermixture of African and European ancestry, much of which comes from the enslaved period. And, it's often not by choice. And yet we think of those people as African American, no matter how much European ancestry they may have, right? So there's this placing of people in categories that kind of is correlated with our genetic material, maybe, but not really. So then to say that our genetic material can determine, the idea that there's a gene in us or a set of genes in us that says what race we are, and can also say what skills we have, what we're good at, whether we're intelligent or not, whether we're more, I don't know, good at math or not. It's really, there's no evidence to support that. And it's a particularly harmful view because historically that view has been very much associated with movements like eugenics, which, based on that faulty or mistaken belief that, races are separate and discrete and different, and some are better and some are worse, that we should try to control things to, breed the ones who are better and not, and exclude the ones who are worse, or even just privilege the ones that we think of as better. So there's a very sort of fine line between a belief that races are genetically determined and that they determine your skills to moving towards sort of acting on those beliefs.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think there's two issues or two barriers, let's say, to us really as a society and as a scientific community understanding that race and ethnicity are cultural and social and contextual and fluid and changing over time and not really having anything to do with biology. And that's different from genetic ancestry, which tells us kind of who our ancestors are related to or who we're related to based on our ancestry. One is that we're highly visual creatures. Humans are visual in nature. We use our eyes for a lot of things. So evolutionarily, we evolved to look for distinctions in things, who is like me, who is not, and using our eyes. So I think in some ways we've sort of culturally focused on those differences and somehow wanted to create meaning out of them. So I think that's one thing that's going on. Another, and probably most potently, is that the idea of race as biological or having some sort of biological meaning that can differentiate people based on skills or traits or whatever was invented for the purpose of colonization, genocide. It's the foundation of systemic racism and inequality, and the institutionalized racism that we have, that there's some sort of fundamental difference between people who look different than one another, when in fact it's a handful of genes that are responsible for skin color, eye color, hair type, etc., that create what we imagine to be meaningful, but in fact is not. And so I think those are a couple of the barriers that it's so deeply ingrained in the foundation of the country that there's some subset of people who look a certain way that are different, and that can justify enslaving them or killing them or taking their land or whatever that might have been. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind with this, is that these concepts are so deeply ingrained in the foundation of science. You mentioned eugenics, which was early genetics. It was considered real science at the time. Now we look back and we say, oh, that was pseudoscience. But at the time, it was considered cutting edge, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind, is the history and how deeply ingrained this misconception is that there is anything biologically meaningful about somebody's race. And that's changed over time, right? At one point, the Irish were considered Black. So it's all shifting, and it's evolution doesn't move that fast. So the genetics is not driving the differences in how we conceptualize racial groups.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question that kind of just expands on the discussion you're having. It's from TM, and it was on Genome TV. When and why we use race, ancestry, or both? So really, I want to kind of push this question of, is there a value and a utility in using race, and how should we use race and ancestry together?
Well, there are some people who argue that race and ethnicity, those two at least, are not a meaningful distinction, that we can think of races as being a kind of ethnicity. For me as a sociologist, I do think that the distinction is meaningful for a couple of reasons. One is that even though there's overlap between what we think of as races and ethnicities, there is a way in which as Dr. Popejoy mentioned, the one is very much based on sort of these visual distinctions that get made, these concepts of descent and who you are based on your parentage, whereas the other one is about cultural practices. And so, imagine you were adopted into a community. You might not look like everybody else, but you could still have the cultural practices. The other reason I find the distinction useful is that it has been historically meaningful in the United States. I mean, you could say that at one point in time, the Irish were considered Black, but traditionally, whoever it is who wears the mantle of racial difference is treated as farther away than somebody who is considered to be ethnically different from us. So there is a difference of degree there. Now, with regard to ancestry and genetic ancestry, the difference between talking about race, ethnicity on the one hand and genetic ancestry on the other, I think it is a very important distinction. And I would go so far as to say that when we think about self-identification, right, how we identify our own race or ethnicity, it's possible that we may in some ways be influenced by information that we get about our genetic ancestry, this information that you get from, say, a genetic ancestry test, as many of my respondents did. But you also see that there's a lot of difference between those terms. They don't always overlap. When somebody finds out that they have an ancestry they don't like, it doesn't change their identity. So those are two different things there. And to the extent that you can tease them apart, I think that is a meaningful thing to do, in particular because it shows us that the way that we think of ourselves is not only about what we learn about our genes, and also because in society, we're not going around with a card on our forehead saying, I am 52% Scottish and, whatever percent, Irish, right? So most people don't know what our genes say. They know what we look like, and they treat us a certain way because of how we look. If I can't get a cab, on Fifth Avenue, it's not because I've got, 10% African ancestry, it's because of how I look. And so it is, I think, important to distinguish those things and analytically to recognize what it is that is influencing the way people get treated.
Okay, thank you. So we're coming to the close, and so I want to just give each of you an opportunity to make some last comments, any message that you want to share with the audience. So Dr. Popejoy, any last comments that you would like?
Sure. I mean, just to follow on that last point, I think it's important to think about race and ethnicity and self-reported race and ethnicity in terms of measuring the effects of racism, because that's very real, right? That our environments shape our biology. And so in the research context, it may very well be important to collect race, but we need to keep in mind that what is that telling us? It's not telling us about somebody's genetics or somebody's fundamental biology. It's telling us about the impact of a society that has systemic inequality and racism baked into it. And so the biological impact that we're looking at is an environmental one based on racism. So to answer that question, that's when I think we might be using that. And I've talked a bit about how genetic ancestry is useful in research and otherwise. But I think the main take home that I want everyone to think about is that, how we all view race and ethnicity and our own identity is very personal, and it's very much tied to the social cultural context that we're in. So being a white person in America means that I'm a very privileged individual, and I keep that in mind when I do this work. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that some people have a lot more depth of understanding and of appreciation and of knowledge on that question of identity than others. And so as a scientist, I try to be really mindful of what that knowledge is in those communities. And if you are thinking of doing research in communities, talking to the researchers, I encourage you to consider community-based participatory research where you're doing outreach and really learning from those communities what you're studying, rather than just taking genetic samples and doing a comparison of whites and Blacks and finding the genetic differences. So I think we tend to reify those stereotypes and that fundamental belief that there is some biological differences by doing those studies. So I would just urge people to rethink those study designs as we're moving science, the field of genomics and genetics forward. And for the individuals, the public, the non-scientists, considering the ancestry test, just back to Wendy's point about not equating your results with race or any sort of national identity, that this might be a fun exercise to learn about where your ancestry is from, but not anything else.
Thank you. So I want to just refer, if anyone has further questions that they want answered or to learn more information, to go to genome.gov. And then you can also email the NHGRI communications at NIH.gov. So NHGRI communications at NIH.gov with any further questions. So Dr. Roth, you get the last comment.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for being here today. What I was going to say as my final comment is that I think it's really important that you are here, because if there's anything I hope you take away from this, it's that the results you get from these direct-to-consumer tests don't speak for themselves. You really have to put in time and you have to put in effort to understanding them, to reading about them, to learning, to doing your research on your own. And I think that right now, especially as the prices have come down, there are a lot of people who say, hey, it's not that big a deal. It's only $59. I'll send away for it. I'll get my result. That's it. But really, that's not the best way to think about it. That these are something that require a lot of effort to put into context and to understand. And I hope that everybody here is taking away something that's valuable from this session along those lines.
Great. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Roth and Dr. Popejoy, for a great discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you.